love coming together Sunday morning, don't you?
Amen.
You know, there is just something awesome about coming together with people we love, with people we like, with people we like to pick on and kid, and you know, we just enjoy our time together, and there's something awesome about that. And when we were singing that song this morning, you know, this is holy ground, standing on holy ground, and especially with the things that Daniel talked about before that, you know, us as a body, brothers and sisters coming together and approaching the presence of God, and standing in His presence in the awe, and just, you know, there's just something awesome about that. Don't you wish everybody could experience that?
Yes.
And yet there are so many people in our world that don't look at Christianity as a good thing. I'm reading a book now. The title of the book is Debating for God. It's a book about a man in the early days of our country who was one of the leading proponents of Christianity. And I never realized how much people were against the church in the early part of our country's history. But the more I'm reading, the more I understand why. And I want you to think about it. The people who came to America, to settle America, came to escape religious persecution. They came from countries that had state-run churches, where the bishops and the popes and the priests and the ministers were the ones who were the authorities of everything. And they ran everything with such a tight fist. And if you stepped out of line, they might even put you to death. And so people left that kind of environment to come here and have religious freedom. So when they get here, one of the things they don't want is a repeat of what they just left. They don't want this big overarching church. They don't want people of great power within the churches, and it led a lot of people to view the church as an evil thing, especially the Christian church. And you think, how can the Christian church be an evil thing? Well, again, in that period of history, this was during the time of the Enlightenment, people were discovering things of science, they were thinking about new philosophies and ways of living, and everybody had this idea that we could create this utopian world here in America, without all of the oppression and evils that went on across the oceans, but we could create a utopia here. Well, one of the problems with the utopia is you had all of these churches that fought. And people would argue and debate over doctrines and issues and things like that. And so these people got this idea that church and religion is bad for society, because all it does is make people fight. Is our world like that today? No. You watch the news, and there are parts of the world where you have different branches of Christians killing each other, and dividing and fighting and arguing. You go down south, and you will get people, and this is, you know, my brother married a Methodist. Yeah. And I know some of you laugh about that, but I will tell you this, that caused a terrible division in my family. I knew of a Baptist girl who married a Methodist guy, and her parents disowned her. And we hear these stories, and a lot of people today say, well, that's absolutely absurd, that's absolutely ridiculous, but that's the reality. And so you understand why these people would look at Christianity and say it's bad for society, because all it does is cause anger, bitterness, and division. In fact, in the time of Paul, as he writes to the church in Galatia, if you looked at what he's talking about, or what the problem is there, it's fighting and arguing and bickering and dividing. And yet Christianity, Jesus' prayer for His church was that they would be one. How does the church learn to be one without the arguing and fighting and bickering all the time? This book that I'm reading, it's the story about a guy named Alexander Campbell. who would debate with, the book is called Debating for God, and he would debate with the skeptics and those who were opposed to the church to get them to understand, number one, that the Bible is true, that the gospel is true, but also to get them to understand that if everyone would go back and live the way God laid it out for us, we could all get along. And Paul, in his letter, as we continue reading through the book of Galatians, we're in chapter 5 this morning, Galatians chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. It's on page 825. We're going to see that in this section of the letter, Paul seems to kind of give out three truths about how this church and all churches can actually attain some unity and not be fighting and arguing and bickering all the time. Galatians chapter 5, page 825, three truths about how to avoid division. The first one is to realize that Christ has set you free. And Paul begins in chapter 5, the first 6 verses, he says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourself be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. But by faith we eagerly await, through the Spirit, the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love." Now Paul begins by saying it's for freedom that Christ has set you free. Well, what does he set them free from? And what he set them free from, this has been Paul's argument to the whole thing, is Christ set them free from the law. The law that kept them as immature child slaves that didn't have that relationship with the Father. If you go back, and we're not going to read all of it, but flip back to chapter 3, verse 26. That's where Paul begins this argument. You are sons of God through faith in Jesus Christ. And he builds this argument that there are little children who don't have a deep, meaningful relationship with their parents. And that's what you were. You were in that slave-type, immature child relationship where it was, don't touch this, don't stand there, don't do this, don't pull the dog's tail, and it was just all about laws and rules. But Paul's argument goes on that now you have been given the Spirit of God. You are mature in your relationship. God's given us His Spirit by which we can call Abba, Father. That deep personal relationship, the same way that Jesus, the night He was betrayed, prayed, Abba, Father. And so that's the relationship that we have been set free from the law and brought into that relationship. And that's why Paul says don't be drawn back into that kind of immature relationship. And he goes on in his argument here, says you can't rely on both law and grace to save you. It's one or the other. Daniel in our preachers meeting brought up a statement that a lot of people kind of buy into, and I'd never really heard it put this way, but it was, do your best and God will do the rest. And that's kind of the mindset that this going under the law brings them back into. As long as I observe these commandments, then God's going to take care of the rest of it. But if they observe the law, and the way that it seems to be here is they're observing the law in order to impress men, in order to give in to what men want them to do. Paul says if you observe any rules just to get along with men, you're no longer obeying Christ. You're no longer in that relationship. You're no longer living for Christ. You're living to impress men. Flip over into chapter 1, verse 10. I thought it was interesting that in chapter 1, verse 10, Paul even says, am I now trying to win the approval of men or of God? Or am I trying to please men? If I were trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ. And so these people that are thinking about going and being circumcised to please the men that are teaching this, Paul says you're not following Christ. You're falling from the grace of Christ, actually. And what really counts is faith. Not about observing the law, but faith, which Hebrews chapter 11 tells us is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Paul says in verse 5 of Galatians chapter 5, by faith we eagerly await through the Spirit the righteousness for which we hope. You know, through faith we trust that God is going to make us righteous. We believe that God is going to make us righteous, even though we haven't seen it yet. That is faith. We don't try to make ourselves righteous by observing the law. And Paul makes that very clear that it is by faith, and he says the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself through love. Now, this can be taken in two ways. If you turn over into chapter 2, verse 20 of Galatians, in chapter 2, verse 20, Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. It is Christ's love for Paul that motivates Paul's conversion. Paul may be saying here in chapter 5 that faith expressing itself in love may have something to do with recognizing the love that Christ had for us. But at the same time, he may be saying the way that you show people you have faith is by loving. Or it could be a combination that we love because we've first been loved. And we need to understand as a church the love component of our faith. I think so often we can fall into that mode of, I've done these things, therefore God must save me. And we need to understand the love component that Paul brings out here, that we are set free from the law because of the love that Christ has for us, not because of anything we've done. We are in that mature relationship with the Father because of the love He has for us. And we've got to be careful that no one draws us back into that immature relationship where we just have to do everything that we're told without being mature. We can't rely on both law and grace. If we do, then if we do what men want us to keep them happy, then we have fallen from the grace and we're not doing things because of what Christ has done for us. If we ever fall into that mindset of, I'll do my best and I'll let God do the rest, we've missed everything God's done. Because God doesn't just make up the part we can't do for ourselves. God has done everything for us through Jesus Christ. We have to live by faith, believing that God has made us righteous. Believing that God has redeemed us. Believing that God has brought us out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of the Son He loves. We no longer try to earn our salvation, but we live in that relationship because of faith, that He's promised us that. And we must be motivated by love. We have to understand how much He loved us, and then we have to look at each other and the world out there and understand we have to love them the same way that Christ does. When we understand this love and when we allow this to mature our relationship, it changes the way we do things. It changes the reason we do things. When I was a kid, one of the chores I had to do, and it was a chore, I hated doing it, I had to take out the trash. How many of you had to take out the trash when you were kids? How many of you guys still have to take out the trash? Yeah. How many of you still have to be told to take out the trash? All right, here we go. I hope I didn't start anything there. But when I was a kid, you know, my mom used to have to make me take out the trash. And if I didn't take out the trash, I got in trouble. And that's that immature relationship where I do things out of obedience to the law. You got that? If I didn't obey the law of take out the trash, there was a consequence for it. Now that I have grown and matured in my relationship with my mother, when I go to visit her now, I want to take out her trash. I want to do the things that she desires and needs to have done. And that's this mature kind of relationship that Paul has taken these Christians to. It's no longer that you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do this, you have to do that to please your dad. Now that you've got this mature relationship, you do these things because you desire to please the one who loved you and gave everything for you. And so it's a matter of realizing that Christ set us free from the law. And while all of this sounds really good and really simple, the fact is man is always very easily influenced. And people can say things that can drag us back into the bondage even though Christ has set us free. And that's what Paul continues on in verse 7. He says, you were running a good race. Who cut in on you and kept you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I am confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion will pay a penalty, whoever he may be. Brothers, if I am still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that last verse. I think Paul is a little upset and speaking very harshly there. And you can discuss that one among your family at home. But I want you to understand, or what Paul wants us to understand, is that men can come in and make small concerns into great big issues and cause a lot of division in the church. Anything, and I want you to notice this. In verse 6, Paul says, faith, or for in Christ neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Say that with me. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love. And then in verse 7, he talks about someone that cut in on them and kept them from obeying the truth. What does it mean to obey the truth? Now a lot of times we've always said to obey the truth means to repent and be baptized. But Paul is talking to believers. They've already done that. So for them to obey the truth is to express their faith through love. That's the truth. Is expressing their faith through love. That is obedience of the truth. Now, anything that takes faith expressing itself through love out from the focus of Christians is going against the grace of Christ. Now, I want you to think about it. Paul is saying this is what you've got to be focused on. This has got to guide everything, is faith expressing itself in love. Anybody that comes in and wants to remove that from your focus, Paul says, is going against the grace of Christ. Arguments arise over small concerns and opinions. Division occurs and love gets pushed away. Turn back into chapter 2, verse 11. In chapter 2, verse 11, Paul says, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. There's that unity. You have Jews and Gentiles all eating together, sharing table fellowship. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself. There's the division. Separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. And the other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. See, little yeast works its way through the whole dough, and before long these little issues have been made into bigger issues that actually cause division in the church. And it doesn't take much to influence the whole church. Paul says in verse 9, a little yeast works through the whole dough. You know, a little bit of judgmental talking can do a whole lot of damage. I want you to flip over real quick with me to James chapter 3. It's on page 855 in your Pew Bible. James chapter 3. James chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, he says, not many of you should presume to be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. Now notice he says, if you can control what you say, you can control anything. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants them to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Well, all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and creatures of the sea are being tamed and have been tamed by man. But no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praises and cursing. My brother, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. James talks about the tongue. And I think what Paul is dealing with here is there's people who are saying things that are starting division. And we need to be aware that the same danger exists in the church today. People can make small concerns into great big issues and cause a lot of problems and division in the church. Anything for us today that removes faith expressing itself through love out of our focus is taking us away from the grace of God. Everything we teach, everything we do, everything we try to convince others of has to be done through love. Not through argument. And not through being hard-headed and stubborn ourselves. Not through just saying things hoping that eventually it'll work its way around and things will happen. I think, did you hear, can sometimes be the three most dangerous words there are. Anytime someone comes to you and says, did you hear? We need to be very cautious. Because there's a good chance that the did you hear is going to be followed by something that someone else did or said that may or may not be true. And without going to that person and talking to them and finding out whether it's the truth, we start division and we start bickering and we start rumors and we start bad thinking about one another. Love, and Lynn brought this up in our Bible class this morning, if we love our brothers, then we'll go to them and we will talk to them rather than going and talking to everybody else. See, the law wants to judge. The law says, did you hear what Randy did? And we start passing judgment on Randy. Love goes to Randy and says, Randy, I heard this. Is it true? And that brings unity instead of division in the church. So how do we combat this danger when it rises its head or raises its head in the church? And that is what Paul discusses in verse 13. And that is to use your freedom, this freedom that Christ bought for us, use your freedom to love. In verse 13 he says, my brothers, you, my brothers, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. The entire law is summed up in a single command, love your neighbor as yourself. If you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Paul, it's funny, his argument all along has been, you're not under the law, you're not under the law, you're not under the law. And then he says, this is the greatest command in the law, and this is what you need to live by. This is the overarching law. You're not free to indulge in your sinful nature or promote your own agenda, or as these circumcisers were doing. You're not free to do things that cause division, but you're free to love your neighbor as yourself. You know, you think about it, the law did cause division because it separated one group of people from the other. But now you're free to love your neighbor. Love your brother. Biting and devouring leads to destructions, and Christians who are loved by Christ must learn to express their faith by loving their neighbor. Church, we've got to learn this lesson if we're ever going to bring other people to the truth. We can never use our freedom that we understand to indulge in our sinful and selfish nature. It's not about us and look what we've done. And look how great we've become. And look at all the people we got here. It's about loving other people. Free to love our neighbor as ourselves. I read something this week. I thought this was really cool. Most of you have heard of Hillel and Shammai, the rabbis who had differing views back in Jesus' time. And Rabbi Hillel wrote this. He said, a Gentile came to Shammai and said, make me a proselyte. Make me a proselyte to the Jewish faith on the condition that you can teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. It says, Shammai repulsed him with a builder's cubit. In other words, Shammai had a yardstick in his hand and whacked the guy and ran him off. That's ridiculous. You can't teach someone the Torah while they stand on one foot. And so the Gentile leaves and he goes over to Hillel. Now, Hillel's telling the story. So it's definitely going to go in his favor. So he goes to Hillel and he says to Hillel, make me a proselyte on the condition that you can teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot. And Hillel says to him, what is hateful to you, do not to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, while the rest is commentary thereof. Go and learn. See, Hillel understood something. Everything is about doing to your neighbor what you would like done to yourself. Everything else really does kind of just expand on that. We can often reach more people with love than we can with arguments. The other night we were at Mulligan's Tavern, okay? They were having a benefit for one of Dora's relatives who has leukemia. And so we went down there to have tacos with everybody and help support that cause. And one of the girls who went to school with our girls came down and was sitting at the table. She was talking with Chelsea. She is going to school right now, she's kind of towards the end of becoming a physical therapist, getting her PhD in physical therapy. And so she's at the point in her program where she has to go all over the country and do internships. And she's going up to Lake Tahoe. I think, isn't that where she's going, babe? Do you remember, Kara? And she asked me, we're sitting there and of course it's noisy, and she looks at me and she says something and I'm deaf and I couldn't hear it. So I leaned over and I said, what? And she said, is there a Church of Christ in Lake Tahoe? And I said, I don't know for sure, but I can find out for you. Why? And it surprised me because she's Catholic. And we've never had discussions. I've never tried to convert her or anything like that. I've just, kind of let things go. And I thought that was weird that she was asking me if there was a Church of Christ in Lake Tahoe. And I said, why? And her answer just blew me away. She said, Because when I go out there, I'm looking for a place to stay. And this is her quote, not mine. She said, the Catholics are kind of, well, stuffy. She said, but I've seen you and Dory take people into your homes while they were doing their internships, and I would like to stay in a place like that. And I thought, you know, the little things we do, that we don't even realize how much of an impact that has on someone. And who knows what kind of door that can open up if we just love rather than arguing all the time. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a time and a place to teach people, but it's got to be done with love, because the greatest thing is faith expressing itself in love, not in argument. So now the question this morning is, how have you been living your life? Are you living your life so that your faith is expressing itself in love? Or are you living under a law where you're trying to just do everything right to impress men and earn something from God? Do you understand the love that Christ had for you, that He expressed His faith by loving you to the point that it led Him to the cross? Or are you still trying to earn it by keeping your own rules? This morning, I want to encourage you, if you need to accept the love of Jesus Christ, if you need to be buried with Him in baptism and raised to that new life, that free, mature, relational life with God the Father, then this morning we're going to invite you to come forward. And we're going to do that for you. Maybe you're here this morning and you realize that your life and your faith has not been characterized by love. And you need to make some changes. Whatever need you have this morning, we're going to stand, we're going to sing a song, and if you will come down to the front, we'll help you in any way we can. Let's stand and sing.